The wind carried the scent of wood smoke and promise across the Montana plains as Clara Patterson counted her last dozen eggs, knowing that if she did not trade them for flour before noon, there would be no bread for the week ahead. It was early September 1878, and the settlement of Snake River was barely more than a scattered collection of wooden buildings huddled against the coming winter. Clara had arrived here 6 months ago with her father, who had promptly died of pneumonia 3 weeks after they had built their small homestead on the edge of town. She was 20 years old, alone, and determined not to crawl back east to relatives who had warned her father against this venture in the first place. The dawn sky blazed orange and pink as Clara carefully placed the eggs in a basket lined with straw. Her chickens were the only reliable income she had. Besides the vegetables she managed to coax from the stubborn Montana soil. The general store opened at first light, and she needed to be there when Samuel Henderson unlocked his doors because flour had been scarce lately, and she could not afford to miss her chance. She wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders and began the 20-minute walk into town. The earth was hard beneath her worn boots, and she could see her breath in the morning air. Winter would come early this year. She could feel it in her bones, the way her grandmother used to say she could. The general store stood on the corner of what passed for Snake River's Main Street. It was a sturdy building, one of the few painted structures in town, with white walls that had already begun to peel. Clara pushed open the door, and the bell above it chimed softly. Samuel Henderson looked up from where he was stocking shelves. He was a portly man in his 50s with kind eyes that crinkled when he smiled. "Morning, Miss Patterson. You are here early." "I have eggs," Clara said, setting her basket on the counter. "I was hoping to trade for flour." Samuel walked over and examined the eggs carefully, holding one up to the light from the window. "These are fine eggs, best in the territory, I would wager." He paused, and Clara's heart sank at his expression. "But I am afraid I cannot help you today. Got a whole crowd of miners come through yesterday, bought up all my flour. Won't have more until the supply wagon comes next week." Clara felt her stomach drop. "Next week? But I need it now, I have nothing left." "I am sorry, truly, but there is nothing I can do." Samuel looked genuinely distressed. "I can give you credit for the eggs and you can take the flour when it arrives." Clara nodded slowly, fighting back tears. Credit would not put bread on her table tonight or tomorrow. She turned to leave, clutching her empty basket. "Wait," Samuel called after her. "Frank Porter was in here yesterday, said he had bought flour from a homesteader passing through, bought more than he needed. You might try him." Frank Porter, Clara had heard the name. Everyone in Snake River knew about the cowboy who lived alone in a cabin 5 miles north of town. They said he was strange, unsociable, that he avoided people and preferred the company of his horses. "He is a good man," Samuel said quietly. "Just lonely. His wife died 2 years back and he has not been the same since, but he would not let you starve. I am certain of it." Clara thanked him and left the store. The sun was higher now, warming the air slightly. She stood on the wooden sidewalk, weighing her options. She could try to make do without flour for another week, but she had already been rationing her food carefully. Or she could swallow her pride and ride out to a stranger's cabin to beg for supplies. Her stomach made the decision for her. She walked back to her homestead, hitched her old mare to the small wagon her father had built, and headed north. The landscape opened up before her, rolling plains dotted with sagebrush and the occasional stand of cottonwoods. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks already dusted with snow. The cabin appeared suddenly, nestled in a small valley beside a creek. It was well built, with a stone chimney and a sturdy corral where several horses grazed. Smoke rose from the chimney, and Clara felt her nervousness increase as she guided her mare closer. She had barely stepped down from the wagon when the cabin door opened. The man who emerged was tall and lean, with dark hair that touched his collar and eyes the color of storm clouds. He wore dusty work clothes and boots that had seen better days, and there was a wariness in his posture that made Clara think of wild animals ready to bolt. "Can I help you?" His voice was rough, as if he did not use it often. Clara forced herself to meet his eyes. "My name is Clara Patterson. I live on the homestead south of town. Samuel Henderson said you might have flour to spare." Frank Porter studied her for a long moment. Clara became acutely aware of her patched dress and worn shawl, the way her hair had come loose from its bun during the ride. "I have flour," he said finally. "What are you offering for it?" "Eggs." Clara went to her wagon and retrieved the basket. "I have a dozen. They are fresh, laid this morning." Frank walked closer, and Clara caught the scent of leather and pine smoke. He examined the eggs with the same care Samuel had, then looked at her again. There was something in his expression she could not quite read. "A dozen eggs for 20 pounds of flour seems unfair," he said. Clara's heart sank. She had nothing else to offer. "Unfair to me," Frank continued. "These eggs are worth more than flour. Come inside. I will make coffee and we can discuss a fair trade." Clara hesitated. She barely knew this man, but his eyes, despite their wariness, held no threat, only a deep, bone-deep loneliness that she recognized because she saw it in her own mirror every morning. "All right," she said. The inside of the cabin was surprisingly neat. There was a stone fireplace with a fire burning low, a simple wooden table with 2 chairs, and a bed in the corner covered with a patchwork quilt. Shelves lined one wall, stocked with supplies. Everything was orderly, almost painfully so, as if Frank Porter kept his physical space organized because he could not organize his thoughts. "Sit," Frank said, gesturing to the table. He moved to the fireplace and hung a coffee pot over the flames. Clara sat, folding her hands in her lap. Now that she was here, she did not know what to say. The silence stretched between them, not quite comfortable but not hostile either. "You are the woman who lives alone on the Patterson place," Frank said, not looking at her. "Your father died back in April." "Yes." Clara was not surprised he knew. In a settlement as small as Snake River, everyone knew everyone's business. That is hard country for a woman alone. "It is hard country for anyone," Clara replied. "But I am managing." Frank poured coffee into 2 tin cups and brought them to the table. He sat across from her, wrapping his hands around his cup as if drawing warmth from it. "Why did you stay?" he asked. "After your father died, most would have gone back east." Clara took a sip of coffee. It was strong and bitter, but warmth spread through her chest. "I had nothing to go back to. My mother died when I was young. My father's family never approved of him, and they certainly never approved of me. This land, difficult as it is mine. It is the first thing I have ever truly owned." Frank nodded slowly. "I understand that." They drank their coffee in silence. Clara studied him over the rim of her cup. He was younger than she had initially thought, maybe 27 or 28. Handsome in a rough, weathered way. But there was a sadness etched into the lines around his eyes and mouth. "Samuel said you lost your wife," Clara said softly. Frank's jaw tightened. 2 years ago this October, fever took her. We had only been married a year. I am sorry. Everyone is sorry." The words came out harsher than he seemed to intend, and he looked away. "Forgive me, I am not used to company anymore." "I understand," Clara said, and she did. Grief was a peculiar thing. It made you want to push people away even as loneliness ate you alive from the inside. Frank stood abruptly and went to a shelf, returning with a cloth sack. "Here, 20 pounds of flour, take it. But the eggs, keep the eggs too. You need them more than I do." He set the sack on the table with a thud. Clara's pride flared. "I will not take charity." "It is not charity, it is neighborly." Frank sat back down, and for the first time something almost like a smile touched his lips. "Besides, I have more flour than I know what to do with. I bought it thinking I would be doing more baking, but turns out I am terrible at making bread. Comes out like rocks every time." Despite herself, Clara felt her own lips curve upward. "You need to let the dough rise properly." "That is usually the problem. I let it rise." "How long?" "Maybe 20 minutes. Clara actually laughed, a sound that surprised her as much as it seemed to surprise Frank. "It needs at least an hour, sometimes 2 depending on the temperature." "Well, that explains a lot." Frank's smile widened slightly, transforming his face. For a moment, Clara could see the man he must have been before grief had carved him hollow. "I could teach you," Clara heard herself say, "how to make bread properly, in exchange for the flour." Frank studied her, and something shifted in the air between them. "All right," he said quietly. "That seems fair." Clara left an hour later with her flour, a strange lightness in her chest that had nothing to do with having secured her supplies. As she guided her wagon back toward her homestead, she found herself thinking about Frank Porter's smile, the way it had chased away some of the shadows in his eyes. 3 days later, Clara hitched up her wagon again and headed north. She had told herself this was purely practical. She was teaching Frank to make bread in exchange for the flour, nothing more. But she had also washed her hair the night before and put on her better dress, the blue one that her father had always said brought out her eyes. Frank was working in the corral when she arrived, breaking a young horse. He moved with a fluid grace that spoke of years in the saddle, his voice low and soothing as he worked with the animal. He looked up when he heard her wagon and raised a hand in greeting. Clara felt her heart do something strange in her chest. "You came," Frank said, walking over. There was surprise in his voice and something else. "Hope, maybe. I said I would teach you to make bread." Clara climbed down from the wagon, carrying a basket with the ingredients she had brought. "I am a woman of my word." They worked together in Frank's kitchen, Clara directing while Frank followed her instructions with an endearing concentration. His hands, so skilled with horses and ropes, were clumsy with dough at first. "You are working it too hard," Clara said, watching him knead. "Be gentler. Think of it as something alive that needs care, not something you are trying to beat into submission." Frank paused and looked at her, and there was warmth in his gray eyes. "Like breaking horses. Exactly like that." He tried again, this time with a lighter touch, and Clara found herself standing close to him, guiding his hands with her own. She was acutely aware of his warmth, the strength in his forearms, the way he smelled of leather and sage. "That is better," she managed to say, her voice suddenly breathless. They set the dough to rise, and Frank made more coffee. They sat at his table, and this time the silence was comfortable, filled with a kind of peace that Clara had not felt in months. "Tell me about your wife," Clara said gently. "What was her name?" Frank was quiet for so long that Clara thought he would not answer. Then he said, "Margaret. We met in Colorado. Her father owned a ranch there, and I was working as a hand. She was beautiful and kind, and when she agreed to marry me, I thought I was the luckiest man alive." "You were young." 26 when we married. She was 22. We came here to start fresh, bought this land, built this cabin. We had plans." His voice cracked slightly. "So many plans." Clara reached across the table and placed her hand over his. Frank looked down at their joined hands, and she saw his throat work as he swallowed hard. "I have not talked about her in a long time," he said. "People in town look at me with pity, and I cannot stand it. So I stopped going to town, stopped talking to people. It was easier to be alone." "But lonely," Clara said. "Yes." Frank turned his hand over, lacing his fingers through hers. very lonely. They sat like that until the dough had risen, neither wanting to break the connection. When Clara finally pulled away to check on the bread, her hand felt cold without his. The bread came out of the oven golden and perfect. Frank tore off a piece, tasted it, and his face lit up with genuine delight. "I did that. We did that," Clara corrected, smiling. Frank insisted she take one of the loaves home with her. As Clara prepared to leave, he walked her to her wagon, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back. "Will you come again?" he asked, and there was vulnerability in the question that made Clara's heart ache. "If you want me to." "I do." Frank looked at her directly, and Clara felt the weight of his gaze, the longing in it. "I very much do." Clara visited Frank's cabin every few days after that. Sometimes she brought eggs or vegetables from her garden, and he would share meat from his hunting or supplies from his stores. But the real exchange was something intangible. She brought light back into his lonely existence, and he gave her someone to talk to, someone who understood what it meant to carve out a life in this harsh, beautiful land. They cooked together, worked together. Frank helped her repair her chicken coop when a windstorm damaged it. Clara mended his shirts and taught him how to make stew that did not taste like boot leather. Slowly, carefully, they began to heal each other's loneliness. One evening in late September, as they sat on Frank's porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple, Frank reached for Clara's hand. "I need to tell you something," he said. "I have not been fair to you." Clara's stomach tightened with sudden fear. "What do you mean?" "You have been coming here for weeks now, and I have been selfish. I have been taking your time, your company, because I was lonely. But I never stopped to think about what people might say. A woman visiting a man alone like this, it could damage your reputation." "I do not care what people say," Clara said fiercely, "but I care." Frank squeezed her hand. "You deserve better than to be the subject of gossip. You deserve better than a broken man who lives alone in the wilderness." Clara turned to face him fully. "Frank Porter, you listen to me. I am not some delicate flower who needs protecting from small-minded gossip. I am a grown woman who makes her own choices, and I choose to be here." "Why?" The word was barely a whisper. "Because when I am with you, I do not feel alone anymore," Clara said, her voice shaking with emotion. "Because you make me laugh. Because when you smile, it feels like the sun coming out after a long winter. Because she stopped, suddenly frightened by what she had been about to say. "Because you what?" Frank asked, his eyes searching hers. "Because I am falling in love with you," Clara finished, the words tumbling out in a rush. "And maybe that is foolish, maybe it is too soon, but it is the truth." Frank's eyes widened, and for a moment he looked stunned. Then he cupped her face in his calloused hands, his thumbs stroking her cheeks gently. "Clara," he said, and her name on his lips sounded like a prayer. "I have been in love with you since the day you laughed in my kitchen and told me I was treating bread dough like an unbroken horse. I have been in love with you since you sat at my table and asked me about Margaret without pity in your eyes. I have been terrified because I did not think I could love again after I lost her, and I felt guilty for even wanting to try." "You do not have to feel guilty," Clara whispered. "Love is not a finite resource. Loving me does not mean you loved her any less. I know that now." Frank leaned his forehead against hers. "You taught me that. You taught me that my heart is bigger than I thought, that I can hold grief for what I lost and hope for what I might have." He kissed her then, soft and tentative at first, then deeper as Clara wrapped her arms around his neck and pulled him closer. It was a kiss that tasted of new beginnings and second chances, of two lonely people finding each other in the wilderness. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Frank smiled that rare, beautiful smile that transformed his whole face. "Marry me," he said. "I know it is fast. I know we have only known each other a short time, but I am certain. I have never been more certain of anything in my life." Clara laughed, tears streaming down her face. Yes, yes, 1,000 times yes. They were married in Snake River 3 weeks later on a crisp October morning when the aspens had turned gold and the air smelled of wood smoke and fallen leaves. Samuel Henderson stood up as witness, beaming with pride as if he had orchestrated the whole thing himself. The circuit preacher who traveled through Montana performing marriages and baptisms pronounced them husband and wife, and Frank kissed Clara in front of God and the handful of townspeople who had gathered to watch. Clara moved into Frank's cabin, bringing her chickens and her few possessions. She sold her homestead to a young family newly arrived from the east, using the money to buy supplies for the coming winter. The cabin that had been a monument to Frank's loneliness became a home filled with warmth and laughter. Their first winter together was harsh. Snow fell heavy and deep, isolating them from town for weeks at a time. But Clara had never been happier. She and Frank would spend long evenings by the fire, talking and reading aloud to each other. Frank taught her to play chess with a carved set he had made years ago. Clara taught him card games her grandmother had shown her as a child. At night, they would lie together in the bed Frank had once shared with Margaret, and Clara never felt jealous of the ghost of the woman who had come before. Frank's love for his first wife had shaped him into the man Clara loved. His grief had taught him tenderness, had made him appreciate the precious gift of each new day. Frank was an attentive lover, gentle and passionate in equal measure. He learned Clara's body the way he learned everything, with patience and focus, until he knew exactly how to make her gasp his name. And Clara, who had never known a man's touch before, found herself blossoming under his care. By January, Clara suspected she was pregnant. By February, she was certain. She told Frank on a cold morning when ice crystals decorated the windows in delicate patterns. Frank's face went through a series of expressions: shock, fear, then pure, radiant joy. He picked Clara up and spun her around, laughing, then immediately set her down gently as if she were made of glass. "Are you happy?" Clara asked, though she could see the answer written all over his face. "Happy does not begin to cover it," Frank said, his hands resting on her still flat belly. "Terrified, yes, but so happy I could burst with it." Their son was born in September 1879, exactly 1 year after Clara had first knocked on Frank's door asking for flour. They named him Thomas, after Clara's father, and he had Frank's dark hair and Clara's blue eyes. Frank was a devoted father, surprising Clara with how naturally it came to him. He would walk the floor with Thomas for hours when the baby was fussy, singing old cowboy songs in his rough voice. He built a cradle that rocked gently, carving animals into the headboard with painstaking care. Clara watched her husband with their son and fell even more deeply in love with him. This was the man who had been so lonely he had forgotten how to smile, now cooing nonsense at a baby and making silly faces to earn a gurgling laugh. Life settled into a rhythm. Frank worked the land, raised horses, and took occasional jobs cowboying for larger ranches when money was tight. Clara kept the house, tended her expanding garden, and raised Thomas. They were not wealthy, but they had enough. More importantly, they had each other. When Thomas was 2, Clara became pregnant again. This time, Frank was less terrified and more excited. He had grown into fatherhood, gained confidence in his ability to protect and provide for his family. Their daughter was born in the spring of 1882, a tiny thing with Clara's blonde hair and Frank's serious gray eyes. They named her Rose because she was born when the wild roses were blooming along the creek. The cabin began to feel small with 2 children, so Frank built an addition, adding 2 bedrooms and expanding the main living space. Samuel Henderson helped, as did several men from town who had come to respect Frank Porter as a hard worker and good neighbor. Frank was no longer the strange, lonely cowboy who avoided company. He was a family man, still quiet and reserved, but willing to help when help was needed and accept help in return. One evening, when Thomas was 4 and Rose was 2, Clara sat on the porch watching Frank play with their children in the yard. He was on his hands and knees, pretending to be a horse while both children shrieked with laughter and tried to climb on his back. Samuel Henderson rode up, tying his horse to the post. He was getting older now, his hair almost completely gray, but his eyes were still kind and bright. "Evening, Clara," he said, settling into the rocking chair beside her. "That is quite a picture." "It is," Clara agreed, smiling. "Sometimes I have to pinch myself to believe this is my life." "You know," Samuel said thoughtfully, "I think about that morning you came into my store, desperate for flour. I almost did not mention Frank. I thought maybe you would not want to ride out to see a man with his reputation for being unfriendly. But something told me to say something." "I am glad you did," Clara said softly. "You changed both our lives that day." "No," Samuel shook his head. "You did that yourselves. I just pointed you in the right direction." Frank looked up from where he was still being climbed on by 2 giggling children and caught Clara's eye. He smiled at her, that smile that still made her heart skip a beat, and mouthed the words, "I love you." Clara felt her eyes fill with tears of happiness. She thought about that dawn morning when she had counted her last eggs, when her future had seemed so uncertain and frightening. She had been trading eggs for flour, such a simple, desperate transaction. But she had found so much more. She had found a lonely cowboy who had forgotten how to hope, and in healing his loneliness, she had healed her own. She had found love in the wilderness, built a family from grief and second chances. Frank finally extracted himself from the children and came to sit beside Clara on the porch steps. He took her hand, lacing their fingers together the way he had that first day when he had told her about Margaret. "What are you thinking about?" he asked quietly. "Everything," Clara said. "How one morning changed my whole life. How I walked to town with a basket of eggs and walked away with directions to you. How lonely we both were and how we are not anymore." Frank brought her hand to his lips and kissed it. "Best trade I ever made," he said. "My loneliness for your smile." "I gave you more than a smile," Clara teased. "You gave me everything," Frank said seriously. "A reason to wake up in the morning, a reason to laugh again. You gave me Thomas and Rose. You gave me a future when I thought my future died with Margaret. You gave me life, Clara." "You gave me the same," Clara whispered, leaning her head on his shoulder. They sat together as the sun set, their children playing in the yard, Samuel rocking gently beside them. The Montana sky blazed with color, and the air was filled with the sounds of home. Laughter, the creak of the rocking chair, the distant lowing of cattle, the whisper of wind through the grass. Years passed, and their family grew, not with more children but with deeper roots. Thomas grew tall and serious like his father, with a gift for working with horses. Rose was wild and free-spirited, always covered in dirt from exploring the creek or climbing trees. Frank taught them both to ride almost as soon as they could walk, and Clara taught them to read from the precious few books they owned. In 1885, when Thomas was 6 and Rose was 4, tragedy struck Snake River. A diphtheria outbreak swept through the settlement, killing 3 children and 2 elderly residents. Clara worked day and night nursing the sick, drawing on half-remembered lessons from her grandmother. Frank quarantined their own children, keeping them isolated at the cabin while Clara stayed in town. For 2 weeks, Clara barely slept, moving from house to house with whatever remedies she could make. She was terrified every moment that she would carry the sickness home to her own children, but she could not stand by while her neighbors suffered. When the outbreak finally passed, Clara rode home exhausted and filthy. She found Frank waiting on the porch, and she nearly wept at the sight of him. He had kept the children safe, kept the home running, and the relief on his face when he saw her was almost painful to witness. "I was so frightened," Frank admitted that night as they lay in bed, Clara finally clean and fed and safe. "Every day you did not come home, I thought maybe you had gotten sick. I did not know if I could survive losing you." "You will not lose me," Clara promised, though she knew it was a promise she could not truly keep. None of them knew what tomorrow would bring. "But Frank, I could not let people die when I might be able to help." "I know," Frank said, pulling her closer. "It is one of the things I love about you, your fierce heart, your courage. I was proud of you, even while I was terrified." The experience changed something in Clara. She began to be known throughout the area as someone who could help with sickness and injuries. People would ride to the Porter cabin seeking her assistance, and she never turned anyone away. Frank supported her fully, taking over more of the household work when she was called away, never complaining about the disruption to their lives. In 1887, Snake River got its first schoolteacher, a young woman from Boston named Emily Wright. Thomas was 8 now and eager to learn, and Rose was 6 and resistant to sitting still. Clara enrolled them both, grateful that they would have educational opportunities she had never had. Frank surprised her that fall by announcing he had bought more land, expanding their holdings significantly. "I want to build something lasting," he explained. "Something we can pass on to Thomas and Rose, a real ranch, not just a cabin and a corral." They worked together to make his vision reality. Frank bought more horses, began breeding them with care, developing a reputation for quality stock. Clara managed the financial side, carefully recording every transaction in a ledger, making sure they saved enough for lean times. By 1890, the Porter Ranch was one of the most successful operations in the area. They employed 3 ranch hands, built a proper barn, and expanded the house again. Clara was 32 now, Frank was 39, and they had been married for 12 years. One evening, as they dressed for a dance in town, Frank came up behind Clara where she sat at her dressing table and wrapped his arms around her. "You are even more beautiful now than the day I met you," he said, meeting her eyes in the mirror. Clara laughed. "Now I know you are lying. I have gray hairs and wrinkles." "You have laugh lines," Frank corrected, "from all the joy we have shared. And a few silver threads in your gold hair, which just means we have lived a life together. Every mark, every change, I love them all because they are proof of our years together." Clara turned in his arms and kissed him. After 12 years of marriage, his kiss still made her pulse race, still made her feel like a young woman experiencing love for the first time. "How did I get so lucky?" she wondered aloud. "We both got lucky," Frank said. "That morning you came to my door asking for flour, I was at my lowest point. I had stopped caring about anything. Then there you were, proud and desperate and beautiful, and something in me woke up. You saved me, Clara." "You saved me too," Clara said. "I was so alone, so frightened. You gave me a home, a family, a purpose." At the dance, they moved together across the floor with the ease of long practice. Clara watched Thomas, now 11, awkwardly trying to dance with Emily, the schoolteacher's younger sister who was visiting from Boston. She saw Rose, 9 years old and still resistant to anything resembling ladylike behavior, racing around with the other children. "They are growing up so fast," Frank said, following her gaze. "Too fast," Clara agreed. "Soon they will not need us anymore." "Then we will need to find new ways to fill our time," Frank said, pulling her closer. "I have some ideas." Clara blushed, swatting his shoulder playfully, but she was smiling. In 1893, when Thomas was 14, he announced he wanted to join his father working the ranch full-time rather than continue with his schooling. Frank and Clara discussed it long into the night. "He is still so young," Clara argued. "He should finish school, maybe even think about college." "College?" Frank raised his eyebrows. "Clara, we are ranchers. Thomas loves this land, loves the work. Forcing him to continue school when his heart is not in it will only make him resentful." "I just want him to have choices," Clara said. "I want him to have opportunities we never had." "And he will," Frank assured her. "But those opportunities do not have to look like what you are imagining. He can build something here, expand the ranch beyond what we have started. That is its own kind of success." Clara reluctantly agreed, and Thomas left school to work full-time on the ranch. He proved to have an even better eye for horses than Frank, and a natural head for business. By the time he was 16, he was managing most of the day-to-day operations. Rose, on the other hand, was a voracious reader who begged to continue her education. When she was 15, in 1896, an opportunity arose for her to attend a girls' academy in Helena. It would mean being away from home for months at a time, but it would give her the education she craved. "I do not want you to go," Clara admitted, holding her daughter's hands. "But I will not stand in your way if this is what you want." "It is," Rose said, her eyes shining. "I want to learn everything, Mama. I want to see more than just Snake River, but I will come home. This will always be my home." Letting Rose go was one of the hardest things Clara ever did. The house felt empty without her daughter's energy and chatter. But Rose's letters came regularly, filled with details of her studies and her adventures, and Clara took pride in her daughter's accomplishments. Frank was quieter during this time, missing his little girl. Clara would find him sometimes in Rose's room, just sitting on her bed and looking at the things she had left behind. "She will be back," Clara would remind him. "I know," Frank would say. "But she will be different when she comes back, more grown up. Our baby girl is becoming a woman." "She will always be your daughter," Clara said gently. "Distance and time cannot change that." In 1898, the Spanish-American War broke out. Thomas, now 19, expressed interest in enlisting. Frank was absolutely against it. "You have no business going off to fight in a war that has nothing to do with us," Frank said heatedly. It was one of the few times Clara had ever heard him raise his voice to their son. "Pa, I want to serve my country," Thomas argued back. "I want to do something important." "Running this ranch is important," Frank shot back. "Your family is important." Clara mediated between them, understanding both perspectives. In the end, Thomas agreed to stay, but there was a restlessness in him that had not been there before. That summer, Rose came home from Helena with a young man in tow. His name was Daniel Fitzgerald, and he was the son of a prominent Helena banker. He was polite, well-educated, and clearly smitten with Rose. Frank did not like him immediately, which Clara found both frustrating and endearing. "He is too soft," Frank complained privately. "Has he ever done a day of real work in his life?" "He is a banker's son," Clara said. "That is different work, but work nonetheless. Besides, Rose loves him. Can you not see that?" Frank grumbled but eventually warmed to Daniel, especially when the young man proved willing to learn about ranching and did not shy away from getting his hands dirty. Daniel proposed to Rose that Christmas, and they were married in the spring of 1899. It was a beautiful wedding, held at the ranch with half of Snake River in attendance. Clara cried through the entire ceremony, watching her wild daughter become a bride. "She is so young," Clara whispered to Frank. "She is 20, Frank whispered back. "You were the same age when your father died and you were running a homestead alone. She is ready." Rose and Daniel settled in Helena, where Daniel worked in his father's bank. They visited the ranch often, and Rose assured her parents repeatedly that she was happy. With both children grown and gone, Clara and Frank found themselves alone again. The ranch hands lived in the bunkhouse, and the big house that had once rang with children's voices was quiet. "We have come full circle," Frank said one evening. They were sitting on the porch, the same porch where he had proposed to her 20 years earlier. "Just the two of us again." "Are you sad about it?" Clara asked. Frank considered the question. "No," he said finally. "I am proud. We raised good children who are making their own way in the world. And I am grateful to have you all to myself again." He pulled her into his lap and Clara laughed, wrapping her arms around his neck. "We are too old for this," she protested, though she made no move to get up. "Speak for yourself," Frank said, kissing her neck. "I am in my prime." They made love that night with the windows open, the Montana breeze cooling their skin. At 41 and 48, they had changed from the young people who had first found each other, but their desire had not dimmed. If anything, it had deepened with the years, become richer and more meaningful. In 1900, Rose gave birth to Clara and Frank's first grandchild, a boy they named Frank Thomas Fitzgerald. Clara wept when she held him, overwhelmed by the continuation of their legacy. Frank, holding his tiny namesake with careful hands, looked at Clara with eyes full of wonder. "We made this possible," he said. "All of this from two lonely people finding each other." That same year, Thomas met a young woman at a horse auction in Billings. Her name was Sarah Mills, and she was the daughter of a rancher from Wyoming. She was strong, practical, and loved horses as much as Thomas did. They courted for 6 months before Thomas brought her home to meet his parents. Clara liked Sarah immediately. She was nothing like the delicate society girls who sometimes visited Snake River. She was a ranch woman through and through, and she looked at Thomas the way Clara looked at Frank, with a love that was both fierce and tender. Thomas and Sarah were married in the fall of 1901, and Sarah moved to the Porter Ranch. She and Clara became close, working together to manage the household. It was like having a daughter home again, and Clara was grateful for the company. In 1902, Sarah gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl. They named them Clara Ann and Frank Joseph, honoring both sets of grandparents. Frank was beside himself with joy, declaring that his family was expanding faster than his herds. The ranch continued to prosper. Thomas proved to be an even better businessman than Frank, expanding their operations and making smart investments. They began selling horses to the Army, a lucrative contract that ensured their financial security. Frank began to slow down as he approached his 50th birthday. He did not admit it, but Clara could see it in the way he moved, the occasional wince when he thought no one was looking. Years of hard work had taken their toll. "You should let Thomas handle more of the physical work," Clara suggested one evening as she rubbed liniment into Frank's sore shoulders. "I am not ready to be put out to pasture yet," Frank grumbled, but there was no real heat in it. "I am not suggesting that," Clara said gently, "but you have earned the right to take things easier. We both have." Frank caught her hand and brought it to his lips. "We have had a good life, have we not?" "The best life," Clara agreed. "Better than I ever dreamed possible." In 1905, Rose announced she was pregnant with her third child. Her first two, young Frank and his sister Amelia, were the lights of her life, and she was hoping for another girl to even out the count. But the pregnancy was difficult from the start. Rose was 32 now, and her previous pregnancies had been easy. This time, she was sick constantly, unable to keep food down. Clara went to Helena to stay with her daughter, helping to care for the older children while Rose was confined to bed rest. Daniel was beside himself with worry, and Clara did her best to comfort him while hiding her own fears. The baby, Another boy they named Michael was born a month early. He was tiny and struggled to breathe at first, and Clara prayed harder than she had ever prayed in her life. But Michael pulled through, gaining strength with each passing day. By the time Clara returned to the ranch 2 months later, he was thriving, a tiny miracle with Rose's blonde hair and Daniel's blue eyes. Frank had aged in the time Clara was gone. She could see it immediately when he met her wagon. There was more gray in his hair, deeper lines around his eyes. "I missed you," he said simply, holding her tight. "The house was too empty without you." "I am home now," Clara promised, "and I am not leaving again." They settled into a quieter rhythm after that. Frank officially turned over the management of the ranch to Thomas, though he still worked every day, unable to fully give up the life he loved. Clara spent her time between the ranch, visiting Rose and Helena, and being the neighborhood healer, a role she had never sought but had grown into over the years. In 1908, on a golden October afternoon, Clara and Frank celebrated their 30th wedding anniversary. Their children and grandchildren gathered at the ranch for a party that lasted well into the night. As Clara looked around at the people filling her house, the children running and playing, the love and laughter, she felt overwhelmed with gratitude. This enormous, wonderful family had grown from two lonely people finding each other on a September morning 30 years ago. Frank found her standing alone on the porch, taking a break from the festivities. "What are you doing out here?" he asked, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "Just thinking," Clara said, leaning back against him, "about everything. About that morning I came to your door desperate for flour." "Best morning of my life," Frank said. "Well, second best. Our wedding day was the actual best." Clara turned in his arms to face him. At 50, Clara still saw the lonely cowboy she had fallen in love with, though his hair was gray now and his face was weathered. But his eyes still held that same warmth, that same love that had made her feel seen and valued for the first time in her life. "I love you," she said. "More now than I did 30 years ago, if that is even possible." "It is possible," Frank said, "because I feel the same way. Every year with you has been better than the last. Every moment has been a gift." He kissed her then, soft and sweet, a kiss that held 30 years of love and devotion. The next morning, Clara woke to find Frank still asleep beside her, which was unusual. He was always up before dawn, old habits dying hard. She studied his face in the early morning light, noting the peaceful expression, the slight smile on his lips. "Frank," she said softly, touching his shoulder. He did not stir. "Frank," she said again, louder, and felt the first flutter of panic. She pressed her fingers to his neck, searching for a pulse, and found it beating strong and steady. Relief flooded through her. He was just sleeping deeply, exhausted from yesterday's celebrations. She let him sleep, getting up to make coffee and start breakfast. When he finally emerged an hour later looking sheepish, Clara could not help but laugh. "I cannot remember the last time I slept past sunrise," Frank admitted. "I must be getting old." "We both are," Clara said, handing him a cup of coffee. "But that is all right. We are getting old together." The years continued to pass, each one bringing changes. Grandchildren grew and had children of their own. Thomas and Sarah ran the ranch with capable hands, expanding it into one of the most successful operations in Montana. Rose and Daniel moved back to Snake River when Daniel's father retired, and Daniel took over the Helena Bank's Snake River branch, which had opened in 1910. Clara and Frank settled into the role of grandparents and great-grandparents, beloved figures who told stories of the old days and spoiled the youngest generation with indulgent love. In 1915, Clara turned 57 and Frank turned 64. They were both showing their age now, moving slower, tiring more easily. But they were still in love, still devoted to each other after 37 years of marriage. That summer, Frank had a spell where his heart raced and he could not catch his breath. The doctor from town came out and declared it a heart problem, likely caused by years of hard physical labor. "You need to rest," the doctor said firmly. "No more working from dawn to dusk. Take it easy, or the next episode might be your last." Frank grumbled and complained, but he followed orders, mostly because Clara threatened to tie him to a chair if he did not. He spent his days in a rocking chair on the porch, watching the ranch operate without him, clearly frustrated but trying to accept his limitations. Clara stayed close, reading to him, playing chess, just keeping him company. After so many years together, they did not always need words. Sometimes they would sit in comfortable silence, hands linked, watching the Montana sky change colors. "I have been thinking," Frank said one evening. "About Margaret." Clara felt a familiar pang. They rarely spoke of Frank's first wife anymore, though Clara knew he still thought of her. "What about her?" Clara asked gently. "I used to feel guilty," Frank said, "for loving you when I had loved her, for being happy again when she was gone. But I realized something. Margaret would have wanted me to be happy. She would have liked you, would have approved of the life we built, the family we raised." "I think so too," Clara said softly. "I loved her," Frank continued, "but I love you more, and that is not a betrayal. It is just the truth. You have been my wife for 37 years. You have been my partner, my best friend, the mother of my children. You are the great love of my life, Clara." Clara felt tears streaming down her face. "And you are mine," she whispered. "Always and forever you are mine." In 1918, the influenza pandemic reached Montana. Clara, now 60, threw herself into helping the sick despite the danger. Frank, confined to the house by his heart condition, could only watch helplessly as his wife once again risked herself for others. The town lost several residents, but Clara's tireless efforts saved many more. She worked herself to exhaustion, barely eating or sleeping. Frank worried constantly, but he knew better than to try to stop her. This was who Clara was, had always been. She could not stand by while people suffered. When the pandemic finally passed, Clara collapsed into bed and slept for nearly 2 days straight. Frank sat beside her, holding her hand, listening to her breathe, grateful that she had survived. 1920s brought prosperity to the Porter Ranch. The war had been good for business, and the post-war economy continued strong. They weathered prohibition with little effect, being teetotalers themselves. Thomas managed the ranch brilliantly, and the Porter name became synonymous with quality throughout Montana and the surrounding territories. But time was taking its toll. Frank's heart continued to weaken, and by 1925 he was largely confined to the house. He was 74 now, and he tired easily. But his mind remained sharp, and he still took interest in everything happening around him. Clara, at 67, was also slowing down. Her joints ached in the mornings, and she moved with the careful deliberation of age. But she still cared for Frank with devoted attention, still made sure he was comfortable and content. They would sit together on the porch in the evenings, Frank in his rocking chair and Clara in hers, watching the sun set over the land they had built their life on. "We did all right," Frank said one evening. "Did we not?" "We did better than all right," Clara said, reaching over to take his hand. "We did wonderfully." "I have no regrets," Frank said, "except that I did not find you sooner. I wish we had more time." "We have had 47 years, Clara reminded him. "That is more than many people get." "It is not enough," Frank said. "A lifetime with you would not be enough." That night as they lay in bed, Frank pulled Clara close and held her tight. "Promise me something," he said. "Anything. When I am gone, do not shut yourself away like I did after Margaret. Promise me you will keep living, keep finding joy." "Frank, promise me," he insisted. "I cannot bear the thought of you being lonely again." "I promise," Clara whispered. Though the thought of life without Frank was almost unbearable, Frank's health continued to decline slowly over the next few years. By 1927, he rarely left his chair, his once strong body betraying him. But his love for Clara never wavered, and hers for him only grew stronger. On a September morning in 1928, exactly 50 years after they had met, Clara woke to find Frank watching her with eyes full of love. "Good morning, my darling," he said softly. "Good morning," Clara replied, smiling. "Do you know what day it is? How could I forget? 50 years ago today, you knocked on my door asking for flour and changed my life forever." They celebrated quietly, just the two of them. Their family wanted to throw a big party, but Frank was too weak. Instead, Clara made him his favorite meal, and they ate together at the small table where they had shared their first cup of coffee 5 decades earlier. "I would trade all of this," Frank said, gesturing around at the prosperous ranch visible through the window, "for one more year with you." "You do not have to trade anything," Clara said. "I am right here and I am not going anywhere." But Clara's promise proved impossible to keep. That night, Frank had another heart episode, worse than any before. Clara held him as he struggled to breathe, tears streaming down her face. "I love you," Frank gasped out. "I love you so much." "I love you too," Clara sobbed. "Please do not leave me." "I do not want to," Frank said, his hand gripping hers with what little strength he had left. "But Clara, listen, you gave me the best 50 years of my life. You saved me from loneliness and despair. You gave me children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. You gave me everything. Thank you." "Frank, please, I will wait for you," Frank whispered, his voice getting fainter. "On the other side, I will wait for you and we will have forever." His eyes closed and his breathing slowed. Clara held him close, pressing her face against his chest, listening to his heart beat slower and slower until finally it stopped. Frank Porter died in his wife's arms on September 15, 1928, exactly 50 years and 1 day after meeting the love of his life. The funeral was the largest Snake River had ever seen. People came from all over Montana to pay their respects to a man who had been a pillar of the community, a devoted husband and father, a fair employer, and a good friend. Clara stood by his grave in the small cemetery outside of town, surrounded by her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, all the life that had sprung from the love she and Frank had shared. She did not cry. She had cried all her tears in the 3 days since his death. Now she just felt numb and hollow. Rose held her mother's hand on one side, Thomas on the other, and Clara drew strength from their presence. She had promised Frank she would keep living, would keep finding joy. She would honor that promise, even though it felt impossible right now. The years after Frank's death were the hardest of Clara's life. She had been with him for 50 years, half a century. He had been her partner, her lover, her best friend. Without him, she felt adrift, but she had also learned from Frank's example. She had seen how loneliness could consume a person, how shutting yourself away only made the pain worse. So Clara forced herself to keep living, to keep engaging with the world. She moved into the main ranch house with Thomas and Sarah, who insisted she should not live alone. She helped care for her grandchildren and great-grandchildren, taught them to cook and sew and all the practical skills they would need. She continued her work as a healer, though she was 70 now and moved slowly. People still sought her out, still trusted her knowledge and experience. And every evening, she would sit on the porch in Frank's old rocking chair and talk to him as if he were still there. She would tell him about her day, about the children, about the ranch. She would watch the sunset and remember all the sunsets they had watched together. "I am keeping my promise," she would say. "I am living, but I miss you. Oh, Frank, I miss you so much." In 1935, Clara turned 77. She was frail now, her body finally giving in to age and grief, but her mind remained sharp and she was surrounded by love. On September 14th, Rose came to visit and found her mother sitting on the porch, a peaceful smile on her face. "Hello, darling," Clara said. "Did you know tomorrow is the anniversary, 57 years since I met your father?" "I know, Mama," Rose said, sitting beside her. "Do you want to visit his grave tomorrow?" "I think I might," Clara said. "It has been too long since I talked to him in person instead of from a distance." That night, Clara went to bed in the room she had once shared with Frank. The bed felt enormous without him, as it had for the past 7 years. She lay down, closed her eyes, and thought about that first morning when she had gathered eggs and walked to town, desperate and alone. She thought about Frank opening his cabin door, weary and lonely. She thought about their first cup of coffee together, the way he had smiled when she had laughed at his terrible bread-making. She thought about their wedding, their children being born, every moment of joy and sorrow they had shared. She thought about watching him die in her arms and the 7 empty years since. "I kept my promise," she whispered into the darkness. "I lived. I found joy where I could, but I am tired now, Frank. I am so tired and I want to come home to you." Clara Patterson Porter died peacefully in her sleep that night, on September 15th, 1935, exactly 7 years after her husband's death. They buried her beside Frank, and the whole town turned out to mourn the woman who had touched so many lives with her kindness and strength. The preacher spoke about love and devotion, about a partnership that had lasted a lifetime and beyond. Thomas and Rose stood together at their mother's grave, holding their own spouses' hands, surrounded by the enormous family that had sprung from 2 lonely people finding each other. "They are together again," Rose said, tears streaming down her face. "Yes," Thomas agreed, "and this time they will never be apart." Years later, when Thomas and Rose were old themselves, they would tell their grandchildren about Clara and Frank. About how a woman trading eggs for flour at dawn had met a lonely cowboy, and how he had traded his loneliness for her smile. They would tell about the love that had bloomed in the Montana wilderness, a love so strong it had created a legacy that would last for generations. They would tell about devotion and second chances, about grief transformed into hope, and the grandchildren would listen, wide-eyed, to the story of their great-grandparents who had found each other against all odds and built something beautiful from loneliness and love. The Porter Ranch continued to thrive for decades, eventually growing to over 10,000 acres. It remained in the family, passed down through the generations, each one honoring the legacy Clara and Frank had built. In 1978, exactly 100 years after Clara had first knocked on Frank's door, the family gathered at the ranch for a reunion. Hundreds of descendants came, all of them connected by the love story that had started it all. They visited the graves of Clara and Frank, which the family maintained with loving care. The headstones were simple, inscribed with their names and dates, and a single line that Thomas had chosen: "Together forever." Someone placed a basket of eggs at Clara's grave and a sack of flour at Frank's, honoring the trade that had brought them together. It became a tradition, repeated every year on the anniversary of their meeting. The cabin where Frank had lived alone was still standing, preserved by the family as a memorial. You could still see the table where they had shared their first coffee, the fireplace where they had baked bread together, the porch where Frank had proposed. And sometimes, on September mornings when the light was just right, People swore they could see two figures sitting on that porch, holding hands and watching the sunrise. A woman with blonde hair turning silver, and a man with storm-gray eyes and a rare, beautiful smile. Just ghosts, people said. Tricks of the light and memory. But the family knew better. They knew that love like Clara and Frank's did not die. It lived on in every descendant who carried their blood, in every couple who chose love over loneliness, in every second chance taken and every smile traded for sorrow. Clara had walked to a lonely cowboy's cabin with nothing but a basket of eggs and desperation. She had left with flour and something infinitely more precious: hope. And from that hope had grown a love story for the ages, a romance that proved that sometimes the best things in life come from the simplest of trades. She was trading eggs for flour at dawn. The lonely cowboy traded his loneliness for her smile. And in that exchange, they both found everything they had ever been looking for, and more than they had ever dared to dream. The end was really just a beginning, because their love continued on in every child who learned to make bread from their grandmother's recipe, in every couple who chose to be brave enough to love again after loss, in every lonely person who found the courage to open their door to possibility. Clara and Frank's story became the foundation upon which generations built their own love stories, each one unique but all of them rooted in the same truth: that love can bloom in the wilderness, that loneliness can be transformed into connection, and that sometimes the most ordinary moments, like trading eggs for flour at dawn, can change everything forever.